I think all these faces are the same from the last hour. We got guys stand up in the back. Where are you from?
Washburn.
Oh. John. You know John Hafferty? No? Yep. K-State, got the shirt on. Other guy in the back? Oh, he's leaving. So we lost one already. So, yeah. We're IT people. We don't like to talk. So, a bunch of introverts that sit in the back row. So, yep. So, as you navigate, EAB Navigate, you know why we're here. Let's jump right into it. The history lesson about a year ago, KBOR said, you got to use this. We got many users that have been using it for years. We got some new people. Emporia State's using it. Wichita's, I know, has been using it for 3 or 4 years. Hayes are not in the room, but I know they are in the stages of implementing too. So it's the smaller schools that are just now implementing it because of the cost. It's one more thing. So, but sometimes you have to eat the cost. So, Judd from KBOR, I kind of twisted his arm, invited him. It's like, it's all a question of what are they going to want? What does the state of Kansas want? What are they going to look for? At the Board of Regents meeting maybe 6 months ago, they put up one slide, talked about it for 10 seconds. It was like 3 or 4 bullet points, and that was it, of what data to expect. And that, I'm not going like, oh, that's not good. You know, you kind of have to know what data to build it. You can't build it and if you don't know the data. So, you know, how are you going to use it? So, Judge, you want to start off on what they're going to look for?
Yeah, they're still figuring that out. Back that up just a little bit. The board has, we talked about it a little bit in the last session. We talked about, you know, retaining students because we all know the state of Kansas population isn't going up. The number of students coming out of high school isn't going up. Years ago, we have this thing at the Board of Regents we call strategic plan. It's changed names over the years. A couple years ago, it was Foresight 2020. It's looking at a 10-year plan going up through the year 2020. And the whole thing was really aimed at increasing awards, credentials of any type. So originally they wanted to increase bachelor's degrees, and then it became, okay, well, let's increase bachelor's, associates, short-term certificates, regular certificates, any awards that we could get, knowing that in today's day and age, you know, there's always a big question mark about the return on investment with a college education or getting an award. And when you look at the data, there is still a significant difference between those that have some form of a post-secondary award versus somebody who doesn't. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting paid way more than they were 20 years ago, but certainly the pay for those that don't have it has been steadily decreasing. And so that gap has gotten bigger. But one of the issues we ran into with Foresight 2020 is having the only metric of increasing awards was the end goal, but then there was 100 little things in order to try to do that. And we can't just go, hey, we want to increase the award 60%. Great. Well, how the heck do you do that? And without more students coming out of high school, it made it a little bit more difficult. So that's one of the first things we started looking at is what can we do as a board, as an agency in post-secondary to start increasing those award levels. And really what it come down to is we were looking at the wrong thing. We need to quit focusing on awards and start focusing on the students themselves. Because we don't have more students coming out, the retention became a really big thing. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Kansas Higher Education Statistics. So it's a portal that you can get to from the KBOR website, and that's actually what I'm in charge of. And one of the things that we have in that is what we refer to as student success. So what we do is we look at a student that's coming in year one, and how many of those students do we retain? So when we look at a first-time entering degree-seeking full-time student, on average, across state universities, we basically retain about 80% of them after year one. Washburn's about 70%, so it's a little bit lower. Each school kind of is up, some down, but in general, 75 to 80% is what we retain for a full-time degree-seeking student. By the time we get through the second year, that drops down to where we're only sitting at about 65 to 70% of that original student that comes in. So we realized that our biggest issue was getting them from year one to year two. If we can get a student to year 2, on average, once that student completes that second year, something like 95% of them go on and complete somewhere. 80% go on and complete at the same school that they started with, because they've got so many hours already at that school, it's not worth trying to go to another institution to do it at that point in time. So that was really kind of an eye-opener for us is, okay, getting them through year 1's difficult, getting them through 2 years was really, really difficult, because some just don't come back after that first year. Whatever the reason may be, it's either they don't have funding, they didn't like school, they're transferring somewhere else, they're going to take a gap year that turns into never coming back. And so that was really kind of what we started focusing on. It's like, okay, no more high school students are coming out, population isn't going up, so let's just focus on the ones that we're getting, because we can't change anything about what's happening in the secondary level. We did all of our research, did all of our studies, and we found that a lot of students at the secondary level aren't even really making it to the secondary level. You know, you hear a lot of talk about first-generation students. What are we doing for the black population, Hispanic population, stuff like that. Well, when we started doing research, a lot of those Hispanic and black students were actually dropping out before they even got into the 10th grade. Well, we're never going to increase that percent of students going to post-secondary because we don't even have the opportunity at post-secondary to get them, let alone keep them. So that became a secondary problem. That's KSDE's problem. So we're going to work with them to try to fix that, but we really couldn't do anything about that. And so then it came first generation. If we can get first generation coming out, it is such an obstacle for a lot of first generation students to go to a post-secondary. I, for one, was a first generation. And I was just telling Doug I'm a statistic anomaly. I was a first generation student that came from a 1A school in Kansas, had 12 in my graduating class. I was ranked 10th out of 12, but I always cracked jokes. I was in the top 10. Came to K-State, culture shock. Flunked out in a year and a half, sat out a semester, moved back home. Okay, I'm going to farm the rest of my life, or I'm going to run a shovel the rest of my life, or statistically, that was what was in my future. Managed to get into Fort Hays and finish with a degree at Fort Hays. And so for somebody to come into a school, flunk out, sit out, and come back, it's very rare. It's very rare to get those students to come back. And so we really need to focus on keeping them in. You know, is it a good placement to start with? K-State probably wasn't a good place for me to start. Didn't know that back then. This was early 90s. We didn't have any kind of student services like we do nowadays. We didn't really have ways to go on the internet and look up what would you be good at? What would you like to do with your future? Stuff like that. So when we started working on that and really wanted to start focusing on maintaining those students, we realized at the board office, there's only so much we could do because really it comes down to what are the institutions doing? You know, in K-State for quite a while, my wife actually works for housing and dining as an accountant in housing and dining, and she always raved about all the student services that the RAs do and the dorms and all these things that's really going on in student life. And my first question was, did that exist in 92? And if it did, how come I didn't know about it? Because it may have made a difference for me, but it didn't. And so, but things like that, Hayes is trying to do some of those things. But what do we do for those students that are slipping through those cracks and aren't taking advantage of those services? And so when we started hearing about EAB and the advisors and the academic advisors and making the contacts with them and finding those students, and, you know, for me, when I went to school, there wasn't a way to kind of see where we were at in our classes. I'm sitting at a C, I'm sitting at a B. I can go, well, I haven't been there in 4 weeks, so I'm probably failing. So that was easy for me. My kids, I have one in Emporia State, one at Hayes, and I can ask them at any given point in time, how are your grades? And they'll go, hold on, and they can get on their phone and look it up. And to me, I think that's a powerful tool that they can go out and see exactly where they're at, because what I hear almost all the time when I get them is, oh, that's at an 88, but it's going to go up because I've turned in this paper, and I don't know why they haven't graded it yet, and I don't know why it's not posted yet. So having that instant feedback to see that and do that is an amazing thing. And so the board, when it came in, decided to kind of change their approach. Let's focus on 3 pillars. When they talk about their strategic plan, they're building a future is what they refer to it as. And you can go out and look at it. We got a portal. It's not done because we're still working on metrics as we go. And this happens to be one that we're currently still working on. So we're looking at basically a family pillar, a business pillar, and an economic prosperity pillar. And the family pillar is the one we're really focusing on right now, and that is, how do we get more people to apply to a post-secondary? How do we get them to understand the FAFSA? How do we get them to, which we can talk about that debacle anytime as well of the change. But especially for like first-generation students, FAFSA was a nightmare, which is what led to the change that's happening. What do they have to go through to get enrollments? What do they have to do to take the ACT? You know, boards kind of leaned away from some of the ACT scores here recently because, you know, there's kind of proof that the better you're off economically, generally speaking, the better your ACT score is. So you can get a little bit more coaching, a little bit more training. So when we focus on that family pillar, it's stuff like that. So we're looking at foundational goals of what we can do to get the students in and the supporting metrics that go along with those. And so that's where the EAB comes in. It's really a supporting metric for the family and some of the areas of focus that we're at, which is the success of the student. And so that is what all this data that we're going to be collecting is going, that's how it's going to be used. So it's a long story, but essentially what we want to do is part of the supporting metrics for those students and the retention of those students is with EAB, and how can we use that and how can we pull that in. And I mentioned in the last session, we may gather 1,000 data elements from you. I'm going to streamline it to 100 and we'll put 4 to 6 charts out there of different disaggregations. But in a nutshell, what it's supposed to be for is our board to go out, look at a series of charts and graphs. Are we going up or are we going down? So it's kind of like Dilbert thing. You know, we got to narrow it down to a picture so somebody can see it's good or bad. And so with that, they've really kind of focused on 6 metrics, but only 4 is what we're really looking at right now because we're still developing out the last 2. So those 4 metrics that we're looking at is really professional advisor engagement is what it's referred to. The second one will be support service engagement. The third is going to be tracking DFWs and courses. And before we panic on that, originally it was going to look at all courses. But I think really what they're trying to focus on right now to start with is what we refer to as gateway courses. So those that took English Comp, did they get a DFW in order to go on to Comp 2? So when we refer to a gateway, you have to take this one before you take the next one, kind of a deal. So some of those core early on general education courses that we're looking at with that. And then the fourth one we'll be looking at is that student progress for those that have below average grades. So that's one of the reasons why I kind of asked that question in the last session. We know if a student is not doing well, but what are we doing to still try to contact that student, get that student in, because they still have a level of responsibility that they have to take. So it doesn't always fall on the advisor's shoulders or the institution's shoulders. But we're trying to give them as much tools as we can to the advisors and the institutions to combat that. Some of us are just a lost cause and we got to figure it out on our own. We're 8 feet deep in a hole running a shovel, and then we decide we're going to go back to school and make something of ourselves maybe someday. So those are some of the metrics that we're going to go into, and like I said in the last session, there may be different names for it across all, you know, I'll say 7 institutions because we're going to track it for all 6 state universities and Washburn. And so really what we're going to do is finish fleshing out really what the data definitions of those are, but primarily some of the things we'll be looking at is really degree-seeking full-time students. And so that's kind of a cohort that we look at a lot with KBOR. We don't really like to hold institutions too terribly responsible for part-time students because they may not be seeking a degree or they're not planning on doing it in 4 years anyways. Because that's really another thing of it is, not only do we want to get them in and retain them, but what can we do to get them out in 4 years and keep them on track for a 4-year degree? Generally speaking, with a 120-hour program, right? We know there's some programs out there that are more than 120, but so when you talk about financial aid, if somebody's taking out student loans, it could be the difference between $10,000 to $20,000 in money they got to pay back if they can get out in 4 years instead of 5. So ultimately, it's how many can we get through in 4 years, get them out into the working world and be, quote unquote, a productive member of society. That's my words. That's not the Board of Regents' words, but that's the idea. Get them through school. Get them into school, keep them in school, and get them through in 4 years with their bachelor's to try to keep the amount of financial aid that they got to take to the lowest amount possible. And so when we look at that, primarily we're looking at degree seeking. We're looking at full-time. It's a little bit easier now than it used to be because there's so many courses available at the secondary level, whether it's concurrent enrollment, Excel and CTE. There's all kinds of different options. A lot of students dual enroll. My kids went to a school about 10 miles from here that didn't have CEP options, so everybody had to dual enroll in something. We were again, apparently I like statistical anomalies. We live in the one area of the state that no community college and no technical college actually covers. It's just a half a sliver of Pottawatomie County, and if you live there, tough. Are you in one of those two? Yeah, it's fantastic. So, you got students coming in with 10, 12, 30 hours sometimes. And so that's part of one of the other things we track in student success is how are students coming in from high school with number of hours, how are they doing compared to what's often referred to as a native student or a first-time entering student at one of those institutions. So those are all things we're tracking. But again, we're primarily looking at full-time degree seeking. There will be some non-degree seeking, but a lot of that is just to compare how degree seeking students doing versus a non-degree. And then we'll look at some of the race, ethnicity, gender, Pell. You mentioned that sometime is a pain. Rural urban is another thing that they're interested in. Students coming from an urban environment versus a rural environment. That's one of the things we're kind of working on right now, the definitions, because there's a lot of different ways to look at that. But once that is defined, and basically what will happen is the people that you're working with EAB will, I guess, set up a tag or maybe put, I don't know a whole lot of the technical pieces when it comes to the categories and tags, but we'll help define that and set that up, probably primarily based off of their home address and where it falls. And generally we just do that by a county as opposed to getting down to a city level, which that's where some of the back and forth is right now. I think some of the institutions would rather we look at it at a city level, but when you get into zip codes, you've been in data long enough, zip codes aren't necessarily the best way of doing that because they can cross over from the city into a rural setting. So sometimes we just look at major cities in a county and then we'll call that county an urban setting. And then first generation was another one I've heard of that I don't know if it's something that can be flagged, tagged, or how that works in EAB, but I know that's a big question mark that our board has. It's just how many first generation students are we getting? So we're trying to get new students in, mostly because data will tell you that if your parents have a college degree, pretty large percentage of the children of parents with college degrees will go on and get a college degree as well. So it's getting those first generation students in. And it's not, one of the things that I know the board is in charge of, the 6 state universities. We do data collection for all the community colleges, technical colleges. We have agreements with Washburn to do reporting and stuff like that. But we know a 4-year degree is not necessarily for everybody. But really with EAB, it's really focusing on 4-year institutions. But it's not just necessarily a bachelor's degree, it's an associate's degree. It's any form of an award that those institutions offer that we're trying to look at and track. Getting a lot of stare. Anybody got any questions? Yes, sir. Oh, you better have a microphone.
Get all this data from our systems. If we could pull this information from our student information system, why would we report out of Navigate?
That's a great question. So my understanding is that we can get a lot of student level information as far as their demographics and stuff like that. But I don't know that right now we're collecting from any of the RR folks at any of the institutions anything with advising engagement whatsoever. So as far as I know, the only way that's being tracked at the institutions is through EAB. And so that's why that's kind of coming into effect of having to use EAB, because as far as I know, we don't collect it, and I'm not sure that there's any centralized collection in any of the institutions beyond that. They will collect that type of information.
So could it be like a hybrid approach?
Yeah, that's what I'm actually going to prefer when I'm putting together the template. We've had some discussions about that. We collect so much data already at KBOR. Quite honestly, in the environment we're in, I don't care to have any more student level data than what we've already got. And so one of the things that we'll try to do is try to push those out at an aggregate level. So some of the things that we'll be looking at, and I kind of showed our EAB representative something that we do within KBOR, but essentially speaking, on a single row of data, we would do a full count of like all white male, rural, Pell eligible, so forth and so on. So that number at the end could be anywhere between 1 and 1,000. And then the next row of data would be all male, black, Pell, so forth and so on. So everybody that falls into that big umbrella of all those disaggregations that we're talking about, and then we'd have one aggregated number at the end. And so that's one of the things we would try to look at it doing. And so that's why we're going to work with EAB back and forth. This is what we're looking for. from an EAB standpoint, what would you call that? How do you do that? Okay, so now he can take it down to the 6 different individuals that are working for each institution, goes, this is the category, these are the tags we want. So now you can go to KU, what is it called there? You go to K-State, what is it called there? Go to Pitt State, what is it called there? And pull them. And so it doesn't necessarily all have to be the same name when it comes from you. As long as we're filling in that template and the data elements are in the right columns, then we can take those data elements and we can compile it on our own and have it there. So essentially, we'll have our FI-sensed ID, so we have your school, and then we'll just have all that aggregate information after that. I don't care. I don't really care or want to have the student ID, social security number, and all that stuff if we can avoid it at all costs. But really, I think what we're trying to do is whatever is easiest for the institutions to get and pull with working with EAB to get that data.
So as you're working on, you specifically mentioned like support service engagement. We track advising engagement pretty well now, but we still have holdouts, and we have, for instance, I don't like to pick on them, but we have faculty that advise that don't want to get in and do things. But for both advising engagement and for support service engagement, are you going to give us clear definitions? I will use an example. Financial aid on this campus doesn't use Navigate, and we've tried to get them to use it. They don't want to use it because it has some limitations that they say is a problem for them, but that's one of the biggest student support offices on campus.
Sure.
So that data is not involved. We have, our academic coaches and tutors, they use it, but there are other support services on campus that don't. So if we are going to have to report those guys in, we're going to need a lot of lead time. For instance, the way the financial aid office works, it's going to require a coding solution because they do things differently. There's a lot of technical work we'll have to do to get them to a place where our workflow will match what you're asking for. So when will we have a list of the exact support services that'll be required to be reported?
Yeah, that's a good question. My guess would be is that we're going to be working on that and try to have that probably, I shouldn't say probably, we're going to have that to you by the end of the summer, because but here's the other thing to keep in mind. When we say have to collect, we know that not all the institutions are going to be collecting everything right off the bat that we're looking for. So I think part of the thing and part of the experiment of doing this is what do the institutions currently collect that we're looking for? What institutions don't collect that? What can they do to collect that? What obstacles do they have for that? And then what can we do to help kind of start collecting that data? Or does it even matter? Does collecting that data going to make a difference if that institution's doing it when we're not really sure if this institution's doing it and we can see a clear positive or negative from it? So I think what we're kind of looking for, yes, it would be wonderful to have every piece of data that we want right off the bat. January 15th, I call everybody up, we collect it, and it's all there. That's not a reality. We know that's not a reality. So I think what we want to do is make sure that we have the definitions of what we're looking to collect. And if you've already got that, then that's really what we're looking to collect in January. And then we can start working towards, is there a possibility to get this other stuff? Is there resources for it? Because we know that's an obstacle too. Heck, we have our own obstacle with having enough resources within the Board of Regents. And so I think really what we'll do is we'll get what we can that we know that's being collected, and we'll work with what we've got to start with. And this is really kind of a multi-year project. So when I talk about building the future and I talk about that portal, I talked about 3 pillars, right? We had family, business, and economic prosperity. We haven't even fleshed out exactly what the heck goes into business or economic prosperity, but we have tabs out on a dashboard with basically a message going, coming soon, essentially. But it might be 2027, 2028 before we get there. So right now we're just kind of focusing on trying to get the family pillar filled out with as much data as we can with those resources. And so it might be 2026, 2027 before the schools are even collecting that information, let alone able to get it onto us. And some of it, quite frankly, they just may never have the resources to do. But the more we can get, the more we can actually display out there that helps the board kind of figure out whether the goals that they're setting is moving that needle in the right direction. So really the board is just, I guess in essence, trying to coordinate with the schools. We know the schools are all doing what they can and what they're trying to do to maintain those students and retain those students and get students coming there. And so, and you kind of mentioned it earlier, sometimes schools are competing for the same students, and the board's not really going to get in the way of that. I mean, you guys have marketing regions and areas you're supposed to do and bring in students. But I think really what we're trying to do is just look at the big picture and the umbrella is what can we get from the institutions to turn around and help the board to make sure that they're planning the right things, that their goals are in the right spirit of moving everybody in the direction that we want to go through. So I don't expect everybody to have all the data, and I don't think that I shouldn't. As a board representative, of course, I'm not on the board. I am a associate director of reporting. So I just happen to be in charge of the strategic plan portal itself. So I work hand in hand with several of the regions in coming up with some of these goals and metrics. But I think we know that there's just some data we're not going to be able to get. And that's the way it is. And it's like that already out there in our strategic plan. Some institutions have it, some don't. Some we can get at a high level for state universities, some we can't get at anything except for like a brand scope of Kansas. And so we just plan accordingly and we present whatever data we can present to the board with that. So if it's something you don't have and there's conversations that there may be a way or there may be an idea to get there down the line, great. If it's something that it's always going to be a roadblock, it's always going to be a roadblock. And we'll do what we can. Yes, sir.
Okay, so, the 10th. So we have the, right there, okay. So we'll have the template and the data definitions by end of summer.
Yes, that is the goal. We have most of the definitions already scoped out right now. There's still a little bit of back and forth on a couple of them. And then we're working with the AB right now just to make sure that we can get a template set up in an aggregate level that we're looking for. And I think that will actually come along pretty quickly. So yeah, the goal is to make sure we have it before school even starts up again in the fall so that can be in place. KBOR normally does a conference every year at the end of June. I think that's really our goal so we can let the IR folks know, even if they're not going to be involved in reporting that data to us, that they know that that's something that's happening on their campus. So,
And as a follow-up, how does that data from the schools come to you?
that's another great question. We're actually still working on that. There's 3 different ways that we can do it right now. And one of the ways that we've talked about with the AB is there's actually a possibility that KBOR could have a login that we could actually get into each of those systems to that one designated area where that template would be so we couldn't see everything else. But they could actually set up permissions to where we just go to basically get this one area and download it ourselves. The second would be is that we could basically do an export into a CSV, and then we could do some kind of file exchange system at that point in time. And then the third way is kind of essentially the same deal, but we could actually set up essentially a web service or a scheduled event where that report would just get sent to us.
If you're asking for my preference, it would get EAB to link Navigate more closely with Edify to where you would have your own workspace that you could go in and grab stuff. Because the more, well, you know as well as I do as you analyze data, that the more transformations it makes, and you don't get first generation data, you might get third and fourth generation data, especially if it goes through a spreadsheet and somebody's massaged it.
Right. Right, and
They could put Edify at the state where you could upload it to that. I mean, for those that don't have Edify.
You mean the state have Edify?
Or both.
To aggregate all the data.
Right, and that was my last question is, what tools do you use, sir, for your data warehouse and then the presentation layer?
Yeah, so basically all of our data we just have in Oracle tables, and in essence, essentially what we do when we build out our portals is we have all of our raw data in all these different tables, and we essentially aggregate it all to start with into basically a reporting dimension that grabs all these different tables. From that reporting dimension, we actually have another layer of a separate schema where we aggregate all that data from that reporting dimension. So on any of KBOR's public-facing reports, none of that touches unit-level data. And then from there is where our portals are actually built. So we essentially create tables that we make with all of our aggregated data, and we actually still mask everything under 5 in small cell, even though all of our reports, if you're not familiar with key stats, all of our reports out there, we actually break down every individual demographic. So race is its own section, gender is its own section, student type's its own section. So you can't cross-reference any of those. And we still mask data, anything under 5. So we take probably extraordinary measures at KBOR that we don't even have to under FERPA to mask student data. I guess if somebody really wanted to dig in and try to go back and forth between 4 different reports to figure out who the one Native Hawaiian female over the age of 45 is that's going to Cloud County Community College, they're going to have a real hard time doing it with that. But and we do the same thing with our building the future data, which is why I don't care to have unit level data and just have it aggregate, because we already aggregate everything anyways. And most of the charts that we put out there, for the most part, probably over half of them, we just use percentages anyways and don't even use numbers. And that's what a lot of these would be. So some of the things we'll be looking at is we'll be pulling that data from you guys to essentially establish, we're going to establish a numerator and denominator, but essentially what we'll do is we'll look at all the students that are, again, enrolled at K-State that are black male, rough age group, and that will be one number, and we'll probably just go ahead and take our own aggregated data to use as the other divided by. So we're not even looking at both a numerator and denominator out of EAB, just one of them. I'm starting to feel more like an expert up here all the time. Do you have a question, sir? Oh, you're helping. Oh. Well, do you have a question, though, while you're helping? No.
I know you have a question, Mike.
I don't know if it's necessarily related to Navigate, but if you guys are already aggregating the data, why are we providing data record reports if we can aggregate it ourselves?
You're talking about our regular data collections that we get? Yeah, so one of the reasons for that is because probably one of the most asked about things we get is employment and wage. So with KBOR being the one institution in the state of Kansas that already has a data sharing agreement with the Department of Labor, basically any institution has to come through us to get labor data for their students. So therefore we need student level data because we do our match with Department of Labor on Social Security numbers. So one of the first things we have to do is scrub Social Security number, make sure it's a legitimate Social Security number before we even send it to the Department of Labor. So that's one of the biggest reasons why we get unit level and student level data from the institutions, is because there's so much emphasis on employment and wage data, which again, we have out in key stats as well, but we aggregate it in key stats, but in order to do that match, we have to have the student level. So that's probably the big primary driver, but then there's a lot of other things we do in federal reporting that the way they break down so many things, sometimes it becomes such a pain for the school to have to do, okay, now we're going to need a collection specifically for this federal report, we're going to need a collection specifically for this, or you could do one big AY collection that has just all the student level data, and then KBOR just messes with all the pain in the backside on the back end, so to speak.
Sure, thanks.
Yep. But yeah, for the record, we get asked a lot about that, and we also get asked a lot about, well, why can't we just use the data that we already get from you to go ahead and fill out everything for, I'm trying to think of what the group is called now that everybody hates. It's escaping me right now. There's another collection that all the schools actually send in, and iPads, that's what it was, sorry. So everything comes to KBOR, and you guys fill out all the forms, and we basically just go through it and check it off and send it up. They're always like, why can't you just fill out the iPads information for us? And I don't know. I don't fight with that end, so I've stayed out of that argument. But really, that's all. Gee, Merry Christmas. I'm sorry I bored you guys for that long.
Thank you.
Thank you. So hopefully that answers some of your questions, but if you're curious about how some of the data is being used that we collect now, again, if you go to KBOR's website, down at the very bottom, there'll be a link to something called a Building the Future dashboard. And so if you go out there, again, it's a dashboard, it's a work in progress. We're going to be adding data to it constantly, so it's not going to be complete probably for 3 to 4 years at a time. But yeah, building a future dashboard, and this data will appear in the family tab, which is going to be the family pillar. There'll be an area of focus called success, and there's what we have foundational and supporting metrics, and the EAB data that we're getting from you will fall under the supporting metrics of that student success. And if you're curious about any of the other things that we do with the data we collect from the schools, I recommend Key Stats. Again, there's a link at the website, or you can go to stats.kansasregents.org, and we have enrollment data, we have credential data, we have grad data, retention data, student success data, employment and wage data, tuition, fees, finance, high school enrollment, tons. We have a ton of data out there. Sometimes it's hard to keep track of when we have to update it all. But yeah, our goal at the Board of Regents, specifically with our current president and CEO, Dr. Blake Flanders, is to try to be as transparent as possible. And so as much of that data as we can collect, we try to basically aggregate it up and put as much out there for anybody to look at, particularly press and legislators, because it cuts down on calls. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Is there any last questions?
So stats.kansasregents.org is the vanity URL. We refer to it internally as Key Stats, but it stands for Kansas Higher Education Statistics. And I think we have something like 9 or 10 tabs of data out there. So yeah, all of our enrollment by academic year, fall, spring, summer, student type, full-time, part-time, race, gender, all kinds of stuff. So. Yeah, the big one I would look at, really that's kind of pertaining to this, would be the Student Success Index tab. So that's where I was getting some of my data when I talked about 80% of the students are the first time entering. So you can go out and look at Pitt State and you can get an exact breakdown of full-time, first time entering, how many stick around after 1, after 2. And you can also look at how many have transferred on or still in the system somewhere and stuff like that. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.